Hello everyone, today I want to talk about 10 art pop albums I think deserve more attention. Before I get started, I just want to shout out Night Channels who saw my last video and saw I was wearing one of their shirts. This was one too, and they gave me a code to share for 13% off their site. That's Advancian. I thought it would be a good idea to begin with a brief overview of art pop. It's a very broad subgenre of pop music. Stuff is miscategorized as art pop all the time because people think that it can be applied to anything that's remotely quirky. Basically, it's a postmodern form of art that merges high art with popular music. Rate Your Music defines it as characterized for its manipulation of signs and its synthesis of cultural art forms, where artists reflect an affinity with art school practices or other musical or non-musical art sources such as pop art, literature, cinema, traditional music, theater performances, experimental, electronic, and so on. A very early example of art pop is the song Femme Fatale from the Velvet Underground and Nico. The Velvet Underground worked very closely with pop artist Andy Warhol. Another early example is Scott Walker on the album Scott 3. Most art pop could be considered experimental or avant-garde, but it's important to note that neither of these things is necessary. Art pop does not have to be challenging or inaccessible. The first album I want to highlight is Kok Saman Curry no Hana, also known as Kok Saman Chestnut Flower or the Teacup album. I consider this a top 5 album of all time. And I consider Sheena Ringo a musical mastermind. I would put her on the exact same level as Bjork, Kate Bush, and Fiona Apple. I pray that there's a day where I no longer consider her underrated. She actually is one of the biggest pop stars in Japan. She's up there with Hikaru Utada. Early on in her career, she basically decided that she wants to have 3 core albums in her discography. And after those were completed, she decided she just wanted to do whatever the hell she wanted. So she went off and formed a rock band called Tokyo Jihen, or the Tokyo Incidents. She made 4 albums with this group before resuming her solo career. Kok Saman is the last of these 3 core records. Sheena Ringo is well known for her maximalist production style, which makes her albums very dense. They often require multiple listens to get used to her sound. Likewise, there's a diverse range of sounds on this record. Some songs are heavy on jazz, while others are really noisy. My favorite song, Rush Job, is the weirdest of the bunch, and it starts with a breaking news jingle, and then it teleports you into a Hayao Miyazaki movie. At least that's what it sounds like. If I had to describe this record in one word, I'd say it's whimsical. And really, I'd recommend it to anyone and everyone. The next album is called Nun Sex Monk Rock. Nina is a German punk icon who began as an actress. She was born in East Berlin, which was under Soviet influence until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. The album has a very strong experimental rock influence. It also incorporates art rock and art punk. Honestly, it's one of the craziest albums I've ever heard. Kind of like a theatrical fever dream. It's like if Camp was an album. This is Nina Hagen's show, and we're just along for the ride. The album is very inventive. The very first track begins with a melodramatic monologue that would make even Bjork blush. And on my very favorite track, Born in Zigzags, she pretends to be a radio operator and then messes up the start of the take. This is just a really wacky album that I already know is not going to be for most people, but I'd say it's 100% worth the experience. Next up is The Color of Spring by Talk Talk. So Talk Talk is one of those rare bands that actually increased its artistic integrity over time. Their last 2 albums, Spirit of Eden and Laughingstock, kick-started the post-rock subgenre, so they're held in high esteem by a lot of music fans. Their early work is much more commercial. It's very heavy on synths and has catchy hooks. Mark Hollis said, in terms of the first 2 albums in a live field, synths are simply an economic measure. Beyond that, I absolutely hate synthesizers. If they didn't exist, I'd be delighted. And on this album, they turned their back on those completely. The album was almost finished when the band's manager became concerned with the album's uncommercial nature and wanted them to have an obvious single. So the band reluctantly wrote the song Life's What You Make It. That's actually probably my favorite song on the record. Band member Tim Free Screen said, I had a drum pattern loosely inspired by Kate Bush's Running Up That Hill, and Mark was playing Green Onion's organ over the top. So I wouldn't consider Talk Talk to be an underrated band, but since The Color of Spring is their transitional work, it often gets lost in the cracks. It's the middle child that tends to get ignored by poptimists and rockists alike. The next album is The Walking by Jane Siberry. Jane Siberry is often called Canada's answer to Kate Bush, but if I had to make any comparison, it would probably be to Joanna Newsom, because both are storytellers first and foremost, and paying attention to their lyricism is critically important. I'd recommend opening this up on Genius as you listen to it so you can read along. The songs are quite lengthy and tell fully fleshed out stories. The Bird in the Gravel, for example, is set in a wealthy household and takes on the perspective of 5 different characters. The master, the servant, the maid, the pantry, the bird, and a boy. It's the type of thing you'd expect to see in an episode of Downton Abbey. If you get a chance to see her live, I absolutely recommend it because I went to one of her shows and I went in expecting it to be good, but I was blown away. She commands and controls the energy of the audience like no other act I've ever seen. She'd go between belting vocals and launching into lengthy monologues, never letting up on the intensity of her performance. She's a master of her craft, and it's very frustrating to me that she doesn't really have her proper place in the pop canon. The next album is Tadaima, which translates to I'm Home by Akeko Yano, who is a Japanese pop star known for her eclectic style. She worked on the Studio Ghibli films My Neighbors, The Yamadas, and Ponyo, where she voices Ponyo's sisters. Yano is another artist that gets compared to Kate Bush all the time. In fact, if you go to her Wikipedia page, in the first paragraph, there's a comparison to Kate. Tadaima is a synth-pop record that's co-produced by the legendary composer Ryuichi Sakamoto, who was Yano's husband at the time. On the very first song, there's all these crazy telephone sounds that are being played over and over again. It's just a really creative, really fun, and playful album. Next is Mr. Heartbreak by Laurie Anderson, who is an American avant-garde artist that was an early pioneer of electronic music. She invented several musical instruments by merging technology with existing instruments. A few examples are the tapeau violin, which replaces the traditional horsehair of the bow with magnetic tape, and a form of talking stick that, in her words, works on the principle of granular synthesis. This is the technique of breaking sound into tiny segments, called grains, and then playing them back in different ways. The computer rearranges the sound fragments into continuous strings or random clusters that are played back in overlapping sequences to create new textures. Laurie Anderson was married to Lou Reed of the Velvet Underground from 2008 until his death in 2013. Her most well-known album is Big Science, her 1982 debut. If you haven't heard that, I'd recommend checking that out before this one. So Mr. Heartbreak remains experimental, but it's also a lot more accessible than Big Science. I find that she really lets her vocals and the instrumentation shine in it. It's a mix of new material and reworked songs from her 4-hour performance art piece United States Live. Laurie Anderson performs all the instruments on it, and it's very heavy on an eclectic style of percussion, which reminds me a lot of Fiona Apple's Fetch the Bolt Cutters. I think the best song on the record is probably the collaboration with Peter Gabriel, Excellent Birds. This song is gorgeous, and there's bird calls that keep repeating throughout the song. Blue Lagoon is another highlight. It intertwines her trademark vocoded vocals with a very delicate marimba. The album that comes after this, Strange Angels, is also very underrated, and I recommend checking that out as well. The next album is Irony by Japanese singer ACO. This was produced by the Icelandic electronic group Mum. ACO has dabbled in a bunch of different genres, including J-pop, trip-hop, and chamber pop. In this album, she merges art pop with glitch pop and IDM. It's very ethereal and futuristic. The album ebbs and flows like a river. There's a lot of crisp electronic textures that almost remind me of an album like Velocity Design Comfort by Sweet Trip. But the most obvious comparison to make is to Björk's Vespertine, and if you like that record, I think you'll really enjoy this. However, the instrumentation is mixed a lot higher on this album, whereas on Vespertine, the instrumentation is more of a backdrop, and Björk's voice is front and center. I really love AllMusic's review for this record. They said, ACO's Irony was one of the most beautiful albums to come out of Japan in 2003. This is airy lullaby music that one might hear in that transcendental moment of REM sleep, just before falling completely asleep. Next is Nightclubbing by Grace Jones. A lot of people know Grace as a fashion icon. She's praised for her inventive fashion, and she was a trailblazer for androgynous artists. But we don't really talk about her music, which makes me sad because it's amazing. She started off as a straightforward disco diva, but in the 80s she began to mix dance pop and reggae. The album is named after the David Bowie and Iggy Pop song of the same name. It's a mix of covers and original songs. My personal favorite song is Libertango, I've Seen That Face Before, which combines the melody of an Argentine tango song with reggae rhythms. The music video is legendary and features Grace Jones dressed up in 3 masks that are slowly cut off of her face in sync with the music. All in all, it's the type of music you might expect to hear at a Halloween school dance. It's spooky as hell. The next album translates to Attic Beast, and it's by the Japanese singer Kyoko Yoshizawa. It has an eclectic jazzy style, and she employs these sweeping strings throughout the album. It's a lot like Sheena Ringo, but the production style is a lot less maximalist, and there's way more traditional elements such as horns and big band instruments. She's very creative. In fact, in one of the music videos from the record, she's dressed up as a man who's in a car on his way to hell. I'll put a link to that in the description. This is just a really wacky, energetic record, and that's why I love it. I'd recommend it to anyone who enjoys cock salmon and is hungry for more. The last album I want to highlight is Apple Venus Volume 1 by the group Ecstasy. This was originally intended to be a double album, but the group couldn't afford to record all the songs in one session, so they took the art pop songs and separated them from the more rock-oriented songs. They released a follow-up album called Wasp Star that created the more rock-oriented tracks. Band member Andy Partridge describes this album as orcoustic, which is a combination of orchestral and acoustic. It has some of the greatest string arrangements that I've ever heard on any record. There's also a recurring theme of nature. This theme, along with the gorgeous Baroque undertones of the orchestration, make me think that this is the kind of record a romantic poet such as William Wordsworth would release if he was alive today. So there's 10 art pop albums I highly recommend. If you do check any of them out, please leave a comment below and let me know what you think. If you liked this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to my channel. Thanks guys!